Some gardens don't become easier because the gardener works harder. They become easier because the garden itself slowly matures. And over the years, I've noticed something interesting. The plants that often struggle the most in the beginning are sometimes the very ones that become the most reliable later on. Not flashy, not dramatic, just steady. A lot of perennial plants behave this way. The first year can feel disappointing. You water them carefully, you check the soil, you wonder if they're even growing at all. But somewhere beneath the surface, their roots are slowly learning the garden. And once that relationship settles in, many of these plants begin asking for less and giving back more. That's what this video is really about. Not just easy plants, but perennial plants that slowly become calmer, stronger, and easier to live with over time. We'll talk about which plants tend to improve after a few seasons, why that happens, and some common mistakes that accidentally keep perennials struggling year after year. Because from my experience, the best gardens usually aren't the ones that grow the fastest. They're the ones that slowly find their balance. And sometimes, that balance takes a little patience at first. One of the hardest parts about growing perennials is that they rarely look impressive in the beginning. And I think this is where a lot of gardeners quietly lose confidence. You plant something that's supposed to come back every year, but instead of becoming stronger, it just sits there. Small, slow, sometimes barely changing at all through the first season. From my experience, this is usually the stage where people start interfering too much. More water, more fertilizer, more moving things around. Because it feels like the plant must need help. But many perennial plants are not trying to grow fast in year one. They're trying to survive first. A newly planted perennial goes through a surprising amount of stress. Its roots were disturbed. The soil is unfamiliar. Moisture levels change constantly, and the plant has to decide where to spend its energy. That's why many healthy perennials spend their first season doing something we can't easily see: building roots instead of top growth. And honestly, this can be frustrating if you expect quick visual results, especially when garden centers often sell mature-looking plants that seem ready to explode with growth immediately. But real gardens usually move slower than that. A perennial that stays small in year one is not always failing. Sometimes it's simply establishing itself carefully. I've noticed that many long-lasting perennial gardens have something in common. The gardener learns not to panic too early, because once roots begin settling deeper into the soil, the entire behavior of the plant can start changing. Watering becomes less constant, growth becomes steadier, and the plant often becomes more resilient than it looked at the start. Of course, this depends on conditions too: sunlight, drainage, climate, soil type. Not every perennial succeeds in every garden, but in many home gardens, the biggest problem isn't patience from the plant, it's impatience from the gardener. And in the next part, we'll look at what actually changes underground over time, and why mature perennial roots often make gardens feel calmer and easier to manage. One of the most important changes in a perennial garden usually happens where we can't see it: below the surface. Because while gardeners often focus on flowers, leaves, and visible growth, plants are paying much more attention to the soil around them. In the first year, most perennial roots stay relatively shallow. The plant is still trying to understand where moisture collects, how quickly the soil dries, and how stable the environment really is. That's why many young perennials seem inconsistent at first. One week they look healthy, the next week they suddenly droop during heat. And sometimes people assume the plant is weak, when in reality, its roots simply haven't settled deeply enough yet. But over time, something important begins to change. The roots start spreading farther, deeper, and more evenly through the soil. This changes how the plant experiences stress. A shallow-rooted perennial depends heavily on surface moisture, so even a short dry period can affect it quickly. But once roots move deeper, the plant often becomes more stable during heat, less reactive to mist watering, and better at regulating itself overall. I've noticed this especially with older perennial beds. At some point, the garden begins feeling quieter. Not empty, not inactive, just steadier. The soil also changes over time. Fallen leaves break down. Roots create channels underground. Organic matter slowly improves moisture retention. And mature plants often begin shading the soil naturally, which helps reduce evaporation and weed pressure. So the garden slowly starts helping itself. This is one reason mature perennial gardens often require less constant work than newer gardens. Not because the gardener stopped caring, but because the system itself became more balanced. Of course, this doesn't mean mature gardens become maintenance-free. That idea causes a lot of disappointment. Even established perennial beds still need observation, seasonal cleanup, dividing sometimes, and occasional correction. But the type of work changes. You stop constantly rescuing plants and start guiding the garden more gently instead. And honestly, I think this is one of the most rewarding parts of long-term gardening. Watching a garden slowly become more cooperative over time. Not perfect, but more stable, more forgiving, and often much easier to live with than it was in the beginning. In the next section, we'll look at the first group of perennials that often become noticeably easier after a few seasons, especially once their roots settle deeper into the soil. Some of the easiest long-term perennials are not necessarily the easiest plants in the beginning. In fact, many of them struggle a little during the first year or two, especially during dry weather. But once their roots move deeper into the soil, their entire behavior can start changing. And this is where certain perennials become much easier to live with over time. One of the best examples is the daylily. In the beginning, daylilies can seem surprisingly average. The foliage may look thin, blooms may come and go quickly, and in dry soil, new plants sometimes look stressed faster than people expect. But mature clumps behave very differently. Their roots spread wider. The plants shade their own soil better. And over time, many daylilies become far less dependent on constant watering. I've also noticed that older daylily beds often compete with weeds more effectively. Not because they kill weeds, but because mature growth simply leaves less empty space behind. Coneflowers tend to follow a similar pattern, especially once they stop behaving like newly transplanted plants. During the first season, echinacea sometimes appears stiff or slow. But after a few years, their deeper roots often help them tolerate heat and dry periods much more calmly. This is one reason mature coneflower beds often feel more stable than fresh plantings. Sedum may be one of the clearest examples of this entire idea. Because sedum usually improves when gardeners stop over-managing it. Too much water, too much fertilizer, or soil that stays wet too long, often creates weaker growth instead of stronger plants. But once sedum settles into well-draining soil, it frequently becomes one of the most forgiving perennials in the garden. And I think this teaches an important lesson about perennial gardening in general. Some plants become easier, not because we do more every year, but because we slowly stop interfering with what already works. Of course, drought tolerance still depends on climate, soil depth, and how established the plants really are. A perennial in shallow, dry soil may behave very differently from the same plant growing in richer ground. So there's never a perfect guarantee. But in many mature gardens, these plants often become noticeably calmer and more resilient with time. And in the next section, we'll look at another group of perennials that slowly make gardens easier in a different way, by naturally filling space and reducing constant maintenance around them. One of the biggest reasons mature perennial gardens often feel easier to manage is that healthy plants eventually begin occupying space more naturally. And over time, that changes the entire rhythm of maintenance. Because empty space in a garden rarely stays empty for long. Nature usually fills it with something. Very often, weeds. This is why certain spreading perennials can quietly reduce work year after year. Not because they eliminate weeds completely, but because mature growth leaves fewer opportunities for constant invasion. Black-eyed Susans are a good example of this. When newly planted, they can look scattered and thin, sometimes even temporary. But after a few seasons, healthy clumps often begin knitting themselves together naturally. The foliage becomes fuller, the root systems become denser, and the bed starts feeling more connected overall. I've noticed that mature Black-eyed Susan plantings often require less constant cleanup than newer beds. Because stable growth tends to create fewer weak gaps where weeds can quickly take hold. And visually, the garden starts looking calmer too. Not perfectly controlled, just more settled. Bee balm behaves a little differently, but teaches a similar lesson. In the right conditions, bee balm spreads steadily underground through rhizomes. Now, sometimes gardeners become nervous about spreading plants. And honestly, that concern can be reasonable in smaller spaces. But in larger perennial beds, careful spreading can actually become part of the garden's long-term stability, especially when the plants are filling difficult areas that would otherwise require constant maintenance. Native perennials often do this especially well, because many of them evolved in conditions similar to the environments we're planting them into, which means mature native plantings frequently become more self-regulating, more resilient, and less demanding over time. This doesn't mean native plants are maintenance-free. That idea causes problems too. But mature native perennial beds often begin cooperating with local conditions instead of constantly fighting them. And I think that difference matters. One thing I've learned over the years is that stable perennial gardens usually feel layered, not empty, not exposed. The plants slowly begin protecting the soil together, holding moisture, reducing temperature swings, softening weed pressure naturally. And once that process begins, the garden often stops feeling like a collection of individual plants and starts feeling more like a connected system. Of course, spreading behavior still needs observation. Some plants spread aggressively in certain climates. Others stay surprisingly controlled. So balance still matters. But in many home gardens, the right perennial coverage can reduce far more work than people expect over time. And in the next section, we'll look at another group of perennials that teach a different kind of patience. Plants that may take years to fully mature, but often become some of the most rewarding parts of the garden later on. Some perennials don't become impressive quickly. And honestly, that can make them easy to underestimate. Because in a world where people expect fast results, slow-growing plants can sometimes look disappointing for years before they finally settle into themselves. But once they do, they often become the plants people value the most later on. Peonies are probably one of the clearest examples of this. A young peony rarely looks dramatic. The blooms may be limited. The plant may stay small for several seasons, and sometimes gardeners start moving them around too early, thinking something must be wrong. But peonies usually dislike constant disturbance. Many of them simply need time. And once mature peonies finally settle into a location they like, their entire presence changes. The stems become stronger. Blooming becomes more reliable. The plant develops a kind of quiet confidence in the garden. I've noticed that older peony gardens often feel emotionally different too. Not flashy, not overly designed, just established. Like something that has belonged there for a very long time. Hostas teach a similar lesson in a softer way, especially in shade gardens. Small hostas can look sparse and unimpressive at first, and many gardeners accidentally weaken them by dividing too early, overfeeding, or planting them in dry, competition-heavy soil. But mature hostas behave very differently. The leaves broaden, the clumps gain weight visually, and over time, they often begin creating calm structure in areas where many other plants struggle. Lavender may be one of the most misunderstood examples in this category, because people often assume lavender is easy simply because mature lavender looks effortless. But young lavender can be surprisingly fragile in the wrong conditions, especially in heavy, wet soil, or when watered too frequently. In many gardens, lavender becomes easier only after the gardener learns to stop treating it like a thirsty, soft perennial. Once roots settle into dry, well-drained conditions, the plant often becomes far more stable. Not because lavender changed, but because the growing conditions finally matched what the plant actually wanted. And I think this is true for many long-term perennials. Sometimes patience matters, but observation matters too. Because there's a difference between giving a healthy plant time to mature and forcing a struggling plant to survive in conditions it was never suited for. The most rewarding perennial gardens usually learn both lessons slowly: patience and placement. And in the next section, we'll look at the common mistakes that quietly keep many perennials weak for years, even when gardeners are trying very hard to help them. Sometimes the reason a perennial never becomes easier has very little to do with the plant itself, and much more to do with the way the garden is being managed around it. Because interestingly enough, many struggling perennial gardens are not being neglected. They're being over-corrected. One of the most common examples is overwatering, especially during the first couple of years. When gardeners see slow growth, they often assume the plant must need more moisture. But constantly wet soil can create shallow roots, reduced oxygen, and weaker long-term resilience. I've noticed this especially with plants that naturally prefer drier conditions: lavender, sedum, even some mature coneflowers. The gardener keeps trying to help, while the roots quietly become less stable underneath. Overfeeding creates a similar problem. At first, extra fertilizer can make plants appear greener and faster growing. But sometimes that quick, soft growth comes at the expense of stronger root development. The plant becomes dependent on constant support instead of slowly adapting to the environment around it. And over time, that often creates weaker perennial behavior instead of stronger stability. Another mistake I see very often is moving plants too frequently. A perennial finally begins establishing roots and then gets dug up again because it isn't blooming enough, growing fast enough, or matching the original design idea. But many perennial plants build stability slowly. Every unnecessary disturbance forces the plant to restart part of that process again. Dividing too early can create similar stress. Now, sometimes division is healthy and necessary, especially for overcrowded mature clumps. But dividing young perennials before they fully establish often delays the very maturity gardeners are hoping for. And honestly, I think many of these mistakes come from a good place. People care. They want the garden to succeed. But long-term perennial gardening usually rewards steadiness more than constant adjustment. I've learned that mature perennial gardens often improve when the gardener becomes slightly less reactive. Not careless, not absent, just calmer, more observant, more willing to let healthy systems stabilize before intervening again. Because every small problem in a garden does not always require an immediate correction. Sometimes plants recover naturally. Sometimes roots need time. And sometimes the garden is still in the middle of becoming what it eventually will be. Of course, true problems still matter. Poor drainage, wrong sunlight, crowding, disease, those issues shouldn't be ignored. But there's an important difference between careful observation and constant interference. And in the next section, we'll talk about something many experienced gardeners eventually discover: why mature perennial gardens often become emotionally easier to manage too, not just physically easier. At some point, many perennial gardens begin changing in a way that's difficult to explain to new gardeners. The work doesn't completely disappear, but the garden often stops feeling so fragile. And honestly, that emotional shift matters more than people expect. In younger gardens, everything can feel temporary. Plants struggle easily, weeds appear quickly, dry weather creates stress fast, and small problems often feel urgent. But mature perennial gardens usually respond differently. Not perfectly, just more steadily. The soil holds moisture longer, roots stabilize the planting, dense foliage protects the ground, and over time, the garden begins buffering small problems before they grow larger. I've noticed that experienced gardeners often spend less time fixing things and more time observing, walking slowly, watching seasonal patterns, making smaller adjustments instead of constant corrections. Because once a perennial garden becomes established, maintenance often becomes lighter, more predictable, and emotionally quieter too. That doesn't mean the work stops. There will still be cleanup, pruning, dividing, weather damage, and occasional loss. But the garden usually stops demanding constant rescue. And I think that changes the relationship people have with gardening itself. Instead of trying to control every outcome, many long-term gardeners begin focusing more on balance. The right plant, the right place, the right amount of intervention. No more than necessary. And strangely enough, that's often when gardens begin looking their best. Not when everything is perfect, but when the space finally starts feeling settled, layered, connected, alive in a calmer way. I think this is one reason perennial gardening becomes so meaningful later in life. Because mature gardens quietly reward patience. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily over time. And in the final section, we'll talk about how to choose perennial plants that still make sense years from now. Not just plants that look attractive the day you buy them. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make when buying perennials is choosing plants for how they look today, instead of how they're likely to behave years from now. Garden centers are designed to sell immediate beauty, bright blooms, perfect containers, plants at their peak moment. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with enjoying that. But long-term perennial gardening usually rewards a different way of thinking. Instead of asking, what looks best right now, experienced gardeners often ask, what will still make sense here 5 years from now? Because eventually, maintenance matters, energy matters, climate matters, and the garden itself begins changing over time too. A perennial that looks small in a container may eventually become too aggressive for the space around it. Another plant may look unimpressive today, but quietly become one of the most reliable parts of the garden later on. I've noticed that the most successful perennial gardens usually feel realistic, not overloaded, not constantly redesigned, and not dependent on perfect conditions every single season. The plants fit the environment, and the gardener's lifestyle fits the maintenance level too. I think this becomes especially important later in life, because many gardeners eventually begin wanting less lifting, less watering, less constant correction, and more stability. Not because they stop caring, but because they want to enjoy the garden more peacefully. That's one reason mature perennial gardens often feel so comforting. The space slowly adapts to real life, to changing energy, to changing seasons, and honestly, to changing people too. So when choosing perennials for the future, I think it helps to ask a few quiet questions. Will this plant still fit the space when mature? Does it match the soil and sunlight naturally? Will it require constant intervention to stay healthy? And perhaps most importantly, will this garden still feel manageable and enjoyable years from now? Because a beautiful perennial garden is not only about what thrives this season, it's also about what continues making sense over time. And I think that may be one of the quietest lessons gardening teaches us. Not everything needs to happen quickly. Some of the best parts of a garden only reveal themselves slowly. I think one of the quietest surprises in perennial gardening is realizing that a garden doesn't always become better because we work harder. Sometimes it becomes better because we finally stop fighting every small imperfection, and instead, we begin understanding the rhythm of the space a little more clearly. Over time, roots settle deeper, plants find their balance, the soil improves slowly, and the garden begins cooperating in ways that are difficult to notice in the beginning. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. And honestly, I think that's part of why perennial gardens feel so meaningful later in life. They remind us that good things often take longer than we expected, but they also tend to last longer too. Some plants may struggle in the first year. Some may look unimpressive for quite a while, and some may quietly surprise you years later. That's part of the process. So if your garden still feels unfinished, or slower than you hoped, that doesn't always mean you're failing. Sometimes it simply means the garden is still becoming itself. Thank you for spending time here with me today. And wherever you are in your gardening journey, I hope your garden keeps becoming a little calmer, a little stronger, and a little easier to enjoy with every passing season.
Thank you for spending this time in the garden with me. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more quiet, practical gardening insights. I'll see you again in the next one.